It looks as though Brexit may have delivered a new blow to consumer rights affecting British travellers. The problem stems from a judgment which was made by the European Court of Justice already last year, and another one from this year. While travellers on board disrupted flights are entitled to hotels and meals if they end their trips in the EU, there were fears UK bound passengers would lose their automatic right to recover expenses from airlines in the European Union. The European Air Passengers Rights Regulation, known as EC 261, has been enshrined in EU law for 17 years, but the UK's third country status after voting to leave the Union has significantly weakened the rights of British travellers. In a ruling on July 19th, the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, held that British travellers are no longer entitled to compensation and care rights under EU law if they fly from a non-EU country to a British airport via an EU hub airport, such as Amsterdam or Paris. The ruling is based on the principle that the UK is now a third country outside the EU and that EU law does not apply to flights between third countries. This means that British travellers who are affected by a flight cancellation or delay on a connecting flight through an EU hub airport will not be entitled to the same level of compensation as EU travellers. And the ruling is a blow to British travellers who have long enjoyed the same air passengers' rights as EU citizens. It is also a setback for the UK government, which had argued that the EU's air passengers' rights regulations should continue to apply to British travellers after Brexit. Yeah, leaving the club and using the premises. The ECJ's ruling is likely to have a significant impact on the travel industry as it could lead to airlines charging higher prices for connecting flights through EU hub airports. It could also discourage British travellers from flying to the EU as they will no longer be guaranteed the same level of compensation if their flights are cancelled or delayed. The UK government has said that it is considering whether to introduce their own passenger rights regulations or that they are as good as that, but it's really not clear if that happened or what the level of compensation really is there. In the meantime, British travellers who are affected by a flight cancellation or delay on a connecting flight through an EU hub airport really have to contact their airline to find out what compensation they are really entitled to. But there are some additional things to keep in mind about the ECJ's ruling. The ruling applies to flights that are operated by non-EU airlines. If a connecting flight is operated by an EU airline, they might still be entitled to compensation under EU law. And the ruling does not apply to flights that are entirely within the EU. If they are flying from one EU country to another, they are still entitled to compensation under EU law, regardless of whether their flight connects through a non-EU airport. And the ruling is still being challenged by some legal experts, and it's possible that it could be overturned by another court. But there is no higher court than this. The ruling stands, and British travellers should be aware of their reduced rights when flying to the EU. A spokesman for a union says passengers' compensation rights for flights to and from the UK are protected by retained legislation, and they set out steps for further enhancing air passengers' rights. And the government vowed to improve the consumers' rights of air passengers in its publication of the benefits of Brexit. They meant how they are taking advantage of leaving the EU. And the document says, we will reposition the UK's approach to air passenger consumer rights, improving consumer confidence and developing trust in booking travel by consulting on additional flexible and modern tools to enforce consumers' rights. Hasn't happened so far. And the Brexit stories with the annoyance of the validity of the passports don't stop either. I reported about it again this week, and yesterday it once again was a topic here in the German media. Because a 20-year-old Brit called Christy Hawes was full of anticipation at the airport and wanted to fly to Mallorca. But then she couldn't. Because of her passport, she had to cancel her vacation to Spain. Christy Hawes told the Mirror that customs officials at the airport checked her passport. And when they saw it, they said she couldn't fly. At first, she thought it was a joke, and that they said the passport is no longer valid. And she was looking forward to this holiday all year. But it was what it was. Her passport was still valid for 7 months. But under the EU rules, it is not valid for travel to the EU. Since Brexit, British citizens have had to stick to the third country rules when traveling to the EU. And these state that Britons can only enter the EU with a passport that is no more than 10 years old. And she didn't know that. Her passport wouldn't have expired until March 24, so she thought it's fine. But when Horse was about to depart from London Luton Airport, it turned out that her passport was a day too old. And the tour operator TUI, with whom Horse has booked, had apparently not sufficiently informed them about the regulations. Only in the small print was there a corresponding reference. But because of this hidden information, TUI does not have to refund the travel price. British citizens can still travel to the EU without a visa for short trips of under 90 days out of 180 days for tourism or business. But there are some requirements that British citizens must meet in order to travel to the EU after Brexit. I talked about this before, but it's important to repeat them. Their passport must be valid for at least 3 months after their planned date of departure from the EU. And it must also have been issued within the last 10 years. They also need a valid health insurance that covers them for the duration of their stay in the EU. This can be private health insurance or an EHIC, this European Health Insurance Card. And they must have enough money to cover their living expenses for the duration of their stay in the EU. This is usually calculated as €50 per day. And they must have a valid return or onward travel ticket out of the EU. And in addition to these requirements, British citizens may also be required to apply for an ETIAS visa waiver from the end of 23. The ETIAS visa waiver is an electronic travel authorization that will allow British citizens to travel to the EU for short trips of up to 90 days. And the application process for the ETIAS visa waiver is expected to be simple and straightforward. And the European Union has a common foreign and security policy, but member states retain sole jurisdiction over the entry and stay of people in their countries. And this means that each member state can set its own entry requirements for non-EU citizens. The EU has issued a number of directives and regulations intended to support member states in defining their entry requirements. These directives and regulations regulate, for example, some aspects that I have here for you. That's, for example, the condition for issuing visas for non-EU citizens, or the conditions of residence of non-EU citizens in the EU, or the cooperation between member states in border control. But they are all minimum requirements. Member states are required to comply with these guidelines and regulations, but they also have quite some leeway to set their own entry requirements. And this is because member states are sovereign states and have the right to make their own laws and regulations, despite Brexiteers denying that. And the different entry requirements of the member states can be confusing and frustrating for non-EU citizens. But that's why it's important to find out about the entry requirements of the respective member state before traveling to the EU. Yeah, they have control over their borders, all of them. And Brexit means Brexit. So the third country thing is not something to take too light. It has a lot of consequences. And if you want to know more about Brexit or other UK politics, the next video is here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.